Disturbing shows are one thing, but realizing they're inspired by what truly happened adds a profoundly darker edge. These are 6 unsettling TV series based on true events. In 1994, the Archdiocese of Baltimore received a letter from someone calling herself Jane Doe. She wasn't asking for money. She wasn't threatening a lawsuit yet. She was asking a simple question. Did you know what Father Joseph Maskell was doing to us? The Archdiocese responded carefully, like institutions do when they're worried about legal exposure rather than truth. They claimed they had no records of complaints against Maskell, no reports, no concerns. Nothing in his file suggested anything inappropriate had ever happened at Archbishop Keough High School, the all-girls Catholic institution where he'd served as chaplain and counselor throughout the late 1960s. That response was a lie, and it would take over 2 decades for the full scope of that lie to surface. But by then, dozens of lives had been destroyed, 1 woman was dead, and the people responsible had already gotten away with it. On November 7th, 1969, Sister Catherine Sesnick left her apartment in Catonsville, Maryland to run errands. She was 26 years old, a beloved English and drama teacher at Archbishop Keough. Her students adored her. She was different from the other nuns, progressive, encouraging free thinking during a time when the Catholic Church was rigid and controlling. She told her roommate, Sister Helen Russell, that she'd be back soon. She needed to cash a paycheck and buy an engagement gift for her sister. She never came home. Sister Helen reported her missing that night. Police began searching immediately, but they had no leads, no witnesses, and no clear motive. For 2 months, Sister Kathy simply vanished. Then on January 3rd, 1970, 2 men hunting in a remote, garbage-filled area in Lansdowne, Maryland found her body. She had been dead since the night she disappeared. The autopsy revealed blunt force trauma to the head. Someone had beaten her to death. But there was something strange about the body. Evidence suggested it might have been moved or stored somewhere before being dumped. Maggots in specific locations didn't match the timeline. The case went cold almost immediately. Decades passed. The murder remained unsolved. Then, in the 2010s, 2 of Sister Kathy's former students decided they couldn't let it go. Gemma Hoskins, a retired teacher, and Abby Fitzgerald Schaub, a retired nurse, both from the class of 1969, started their own investigation. They created a Facebook group called Justice for Catherine Sesnick and Joyce Malecki. Joyce was another young woman who had been abducted and murdered just 4 days after Sister Kathy vanished. Her body was found in a nearby military reservation. The cases were investigated separately, but Gemma and Abby suspected they were connected. As they dug into old newspaper clippings and police reports, as they interviewed former classmates and family members, a pattern emerged, and it was far more disturbing than a random murder. Former students began coming forward with stories they had buried for decades. Stories about Father Joseph Maskell, the school's chaplain. He was more than a priest. He positioned himself as the school's psychologist, the counselor students were sent to when they had problems at home. He targeted vulnerable girls, girls from broken families, girls who were struggling, girls who trusted him, because that's what you did with priests in 1960s Catholic Baltimore. You trusted them absolutely. Teresa Lancaster was one of the first to speak publicly. She described being called to Maskell's office repeatedly. He would lock the door, he would tell her she was special, that she needed guidance. Then he would assault her. She wasn't alone. Jean Hargadon Weiner was the Jane Doe who had written that letter in 1994. She had kept her identity hidden for years, but now she was ready to tell the world what Father Maskell had done. She was 14 years old in 1967 when it started. Maskell would call her to his office during school hours. He would give her drinks that made her dizzy and confused. He would hypnotize her or drug her. Then he would rape. But it wasn't just Maskell. Weiner described a ring of men, police officers, other priests, local figures, men who took turns assaulting girls in Maskell's office or in locations off campus. The abuse wasn't random. It was organized, systematic, protected. Then Weiner described something that connected everything. Shortly after Sister Kathy disappeared in November 1969, Maskell drove Weiner to a wooded area, the same area where Kathy's body would later be found. He showed her something in the woods. guards. It was Sister Kathy's body, decomposing, maggots visible. Wayner was 16 years old. Maskell leaned close and said, "You see what happens when you say bad things about people?" The message was clear. If you talk, this is what will happen to you. Wayner stayed silent for over 20 years. The memory was so traumatic that her mind buried it completely. It wasn't until 1992, during therapy, that the memories started returning in fragments. Flashes of images, sounds, smells, the feeling of absolute terror. Other survivors came forward. Donna von Den Bosch, Debbie Jahn. More than a dozen women eventually spoke publicly. They all described the same pattern. Maskell grooming them, Maskell assaulting them, Maskell threatening them. Some described being taken to the school gynecologist, Dr. Christian Richter, for invasive exams performed without gloves or chaperones. Exams that had no medical purpose except to violate and humiliate. The survivors believed Sister Kathy had found out. Students had confided in her. She was the one teacher they trusted, and she was planning to report it. That's why she was killed. In 1994, Jane Doe and another survivor using the name Jane Roe filed a lawsuit against Father Maskell, the Archdiocese of Baltimore, the School Sisters of Notre Dame, and Dr. Richter. They alleged years of sexual abuse and a massive cover-up. The Archdiocese fought back viciously. They hired aggressive lawyers who attacked the credibility of repressed memories. They brought in psychiatrists who testified that such memories were unreliable, probably false, maybe even planted by therapists. They buried the survivors in legal motions and intimidation tactics, anonymous threats, pressure on witnesses. The full power of the Catholic Church turned against women who just wanted someone to acknowledge what had been done to them. Documents surfaced during discovery. Internal Archdiocese files showing complaints against Maskell dating back to the 1960s. Reports of inappropriate behavior at previous parishes. Warnings that were ignored. Transfers that were arranged quietly to avoid scandal. The Church knew. They had always known, but the case was dismissed. Maryland law at the time required abuse claims to be filed within 3 years. The statute of limitations had expired. The survivors lost everything, not because they were lying, not because the evidence wasn't there, but because time had run out. Maskell briefly fled to Ireland. Then he came back. He lived freely until his death in 2001. Gemma and Abby kept investigating. They explored other suspects. Edgar Davidson, a local man whose wife said he came home with blood on his shirt the night Sister Kathy disappeared. Billy Schmidt, whose family members recalled suspicious behavior and a confession to murder. Police officers with ties to Maskell. A web of complicity that stretched through Baltimore's Catholic community and law enforcement. Everyone protected everyone else. Sister Kathy's sister, Marilyn, joined the investigation. She revealed that Kathy had been considering leaving the convent. She was disillusioned with church bureaucracy. She had formed a close relationship with Father Jerry Koob, another priest, possibly romantic. Koob was questioned extensively. He passed a polygraph. He denied involvement, but questions remained. In 2017, the Archdiocese finally released documents confirming abuse at Maskell's previous parish, St. Clement's Church. They admitted they'd known about complaints as early as 1968. Before he ever set foot in Archbishop Keogh, they had moved him anyway. That same year, Maskell's body was exhumed for DNA testing. The results cleared him of physically killing Sister Kathy. But that didn't mean he wasn't involved. It just meant he probably didn't act alone. Maryland changed its statute of limitations law in 2017, allowing survivors to file claims decades after the abuse occurred. It was too late to prosecute Maskell, but it opened doors for other survivors across the state. Jean Wayner found peace through advocacy. She speaks publicly now. She helps other survivors. She refuses to let shame define her. But Sister Kathy's murder remains officially unsolved. No one has been arrested. No one has been charged. The case is still open technically, but Baltimore police have made it clear they don't expect it to be solved. Too much time has passed. Too many witnesses are dead. Too much evidence has been lost or destroyed. Here's what makes the Keepers so deeply disturbing. It's not just about one murder or even one abuser. It's about an entire system that protected predators because protecting the institution mattered more than protecting children. The Catholic Church knew what Maskell was doing and moved him to new parishes where he could find new victims. Baltimore police, some of whom were allegedly involved in the abuse themselves, failed to investigate properly. Social services ignored signs. Teachers looked the other way. Parents didn't believe their daughters because doubting a priest felt like doubting God. And the most terrifying part, this wasn't unique to Baltimore. This pattern has repeated in dioceses across the world. Thousands of survivors, thousands of abusers, decades of cover-ups. The Keepers is just one story, one school, one nun who tried to do the right thing and paid with her life. The survivors of Archbishop Keough High School lost their childhoods, their sense of safety, and for many, their faith in humanity. Some struggled with addiction, some attempted suicide. Some spent decades in therapy trying to understand why the adults who were supposed to protect them had failed so completely. Jean Vayner once said, "The worst part wasn't the abuse itself. It was the silence, the way everyone acted like it never happened, the way the church treated them like liars, trying to get money instead of victims seeking acknowledgement. That silence," she said, "was its own form of violence, and it lasted far longer than the abuse." The documentary ends without solving the murder, but it accomplishes something more important. It gives survivors a voice. It exposes the mechanics of institutional cover-ups. It forces people to confront uncomfortable truths about the organizations they trust. And it reminds us that evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it looks like a priest in a collar. Sometimes it wears a badge. Sometimes it sits in an office with a title that demands respect. Sister Kathy Sesnick deserved better. So did Jean Vayner, Teresa Lancaster, and every girl who walked into Father Mescal's office and walked out changed forever. Justice may never come for them, but the truth finally has, and that truth refuses to stay buried anymore. But the Keepers wasn't the only case where institutions chose reputation over justice, where power protected predators instead of victims. The Enfield Haunting, released in 2015, recreates one of the most terrifying and controversial paranormal cases in British history. It follows the Hodgson family, whose modest council house in North London became the center of what many believed to be a genuine poltergeist attack. The show was crafted with chilling attention to detail, recreating the cramped 1970s home with peeling wallpaper and period-accurate decor. Eleanor Worthington Cox, who played 11-year-old Janet Hodgson, underwent extensive preparation to portray a girl supposedly possessed by malevolent spirits. But no matter how convincing the performances looked, nothing could match the absolute terror of what actually happened in Enfield between 1977 and 1979. On a humid August night in 1977, something evil began in a small terraced house at 284 Green Street in Enfield, North London. The Hodgson family lived there, struggling to make ends meet. Peggy Hodgson was a single mother of 4, abandoned by her husband and barely scraping by financially. Her children were Margaret, 13, Janet, 11, Johnny, 10, and little Billy, just 7 years old. The girls shared a cramped bedroom, and one night, Margaret decided to frighten her younger sister with ghost stories about the Crooked Man, an urban legend meant to terrify children. Janet was scared, but they laughed it off and tried to sleep. Then the knocking started. Loud, rhythmic bangs echoed through the walls like something demanding to be let in. The girls screamed. Peggy rushed in, dismissing it as imagination or noise from the neighbors next door. She had no idea this was just the beginning, but the phenomena didn't stop. The next night, the entire household was awakened by violent banging sounds that shook the walls. Then furniture began to move on its own. A heavy chest of drawers slid across the bedroom floor without anyone touching it, scraping loudly against the wood. Toys flew through the air like missiles, smashing against walls and shattering. Terrified and shaking, Peggy called the police. 2 constables arrived, skeptical but professional. What they witnessed changed everything. One officer later reported seeing a chair levitate several feet off the ground and slide across the floor while everyone stood back, frozen in fear. The police left quickly, baffled and deeply unsettled. They advised Peggy to contact the church or perhaps the media, anything but call them back. Desperate for answers and fearing for her children's safety, Peggy reached out to the Daily Mirror newspaper. Reporters arrived, sensing a sensational story about a poltergeist terrorizing a working working-class family. They witnessed objects moving and decided to contact the Society for Psychical Research, a group of amateur paranormal investigators. This is when Maurice Grosse entered the picture. Maurice was a middle-aged inventor and enthusiastic but inexperienced member of the SPR. What drove him to take this case wasn't just curiosity. A year earlier, Maurice's beloved daughter Janet, the same age as the Hodgson girl, had died in a motorcycle accident. Maurice and his wife Betty were devastated, drowning in grief that never seemed to end. Maurice often visited his daughter's grave, struggling with severe depression and questioning everything he believed about death. When the SPR assigned him the Enfield case, he saw it as more than an investigation. It was a chance to prove the existence of an afterlife, perhaps even to connect with his lost child somehow. Maurice arrived at the Hodgson home carrying recording equipment, cameras, and notebooks. He was polite but awkward, and Peggy, though skeptical, allowed him to stay in the spare room to monitor the terrifying activity overnight. As Morris settled in, the phenomena intensified dramatically, as if something knew he was watching. Knocks responded to questions, rapping out numbers or yes and no answers, like some invisible intelligence was communicating from beyond. Objects flew across rooms violently. Books, marbles, even a Lego brick struck Maurice in the head, hard enough to leave a mark, but Janet became the focal point of the horror. She was thrown from her bed violently multiple times, landing on the floor with bruises covering her small body. Maurice bonded with her immediately, offering fatherly comfort, unconsciously projecting his grief onto this frightened child who reminded him so much of his own daughter. He recorded everything meticulously, desperate to capture proof. The family experienced constant chaos that never seemed to end. Lights flickered on and off. Doors slammed shut on their own with tremendous force. Cold spots appeared in rooms, so cold you could see your breath even in summer. Then something even more disturbing happened that would haunt everyone involved. Janet went into a trance-like state while lying in her bed, her eyes rolling back. Her voice changed completely, becoming a deep, gravelly male tone that cursed and threatened the family with violence. The voice claimed to be Joe Watson, a former resident of the house who had died years earlier in the armchair downstairs from a brain hemorrhage. The voice was filled with rage and hatred, speaking in broken sentences about pain and wanting to hurt the living. Maurice was shocked but excited. This could be proof of life after death. He researched local records and tracked down Joe's adult son, Ray, who confirmed that his father had indeed lived and died in that house. Ray described Joe as an abusive, unpleasant man, possibly even a child abuser, adding a sinister and sickening layer to the haunting. The thing speaking through Janet wasn't just a ghost, it was something cruel that enjoyed tormenting this family. The investigation continued as Morris called for backup from the SPR, realizing he was in over his head. Guy Lyon Playfair, a more experienced investigator and author, joined the case at Maurice's request. Guy was skeptical, methodical, and practical, a stark contrast to Maurice's emotional approach. He suspected the girls were pulling off a hoax, perhaps using ventriloquism or simple pranks to cope with family stress and poverty. Guy moved into the house as well, setting up even more equipment and cameras. Tensions rose between the two men. Guy accused Maurice of being too emotionally involved because of his deceased daughter, while Maurice defended the evidence he had collected with his own eyes and ears. The family dynamics began to fracture under the pressure. Peggy snapped at the children constantly, exhausted and terrified. Johnny and Billy hid in corners, refusing to sleep alone. Margaret defended Janet but showed signs of jealousy at all the attention her younger sister received from the investigators and media. The hauntings escalated to absolutely terrifying levels that nobody could explain away. Janet was physically attacked repeatedly, choked by invisible hands that left finger-shaped bruises on her throat, dragged across floors by her hair, and even levitated briefly in front of multiple witnesses who swore they saw her floating. Objects flew more violently, breaking windows and injuring people who got too close. In one particularly frightening incident, Guy himself was pinned to the ceiling by an unseen force, held there for several seconds before being dropped hard to the floor, an experience that shook his skepticism to its core. He now believed something genuinely evil was happening, though he still wanted rational explanations. The voice of Joe became more aggressive and threatening, revealing abusive tendencies from his life and stating clearly that he wanted to harm Janet specifically, to make her suffer. Maurice and Guy questioned the spirit repeatedly, but it taunted them cruelly. At one point, the voice told Maurice that his daughter was burning in hell and screaming his name, a psychological attack that caused Maurice to break down completely, sobbing and lashing out at Guy. In anger and despair, desperate for answers and fearing someone would die, they contacted a psychic medium named Annie, who immediately sensed multiple entities in the house, but warned that poltergeists feed on negative emotions like grief, anger, fear, and poverty. The house was a perfect feeding ground. Annie attempted a seance to communicate peacefully, but it backfired spectacularly. The room filled with violent banging that sounded like hammers on the walls, and Janet convulsed on the floor, speaking in multiple overlapping voices, some male, some female, some childlike, all angry. Guy began researching poltergeists as psychokinetic energy generated by pubescent girls under extreme stress, suggesting it might not be a traditional ghost at all, but something coming from Janet herself, something she couldn't control. Family secrets emerged during this time. Peggy admitted the emotional toll of her divorce and her failures as a mother. Janet confessed to feeling angry inside all the time, like something dark was growing within her that wanted out. The situation reached a breaking point that terrified everyone. A local vicar attempted an exorcism, but it failed miserably, only making things worse. The phenomena peaked with shadowy apparitions appearing throughout the house, the family dog dying mysteriously with no injuries, and Janet being hospitalized after a severe attack where her bed flipped over violently in the hospital ward, terrifying the nurses who refused to go near her. Back home, sinks filled with blood that poured from the taps, walls seemed to ooze dark liquid, and multiple voices tormented the family day and night without rest. Maurice and Guy dug deeper into Joe's backstory, obtaining his ashes from Ray, believing they could use them in some kind of ritual to banish the spirit back to where it came from. Then came the confession that changed everything. Overwhelmed by chaos and relentless media attention that made them feel like circus freaks, Janet and Margaret admitted to Peggy that some events had been faked. They had used tricks like hidden strings to move small objects, seeking attention amid feelings of neglect from their overwhelmed mother. They confessed this to Maurice and Guy as well, claiming some of the haunting was a hoax for publicity or an escape from their miserable poverty. Maurice was heartbroken, feeling utterly betrayed, and stormed out of the house. Guy felt vindicated, but something nagged at him, a feeling that this confession didn't explain everything they'd witnessed. However, as the investigators drove away, genuine activity resumed with terrifying violence that couldn't be faked. Janet was possessed again, levitating fully off the ground and spinning in midair, and the voice begged for help in a desperate tone, revealing that Joe was trapped between worlds and suffering horribly. The girls called Maurice and Guy back frantically, admitting the confession was only partial. They had faked some small things, yes, but not everything. Not the big stuff, not the attacks, not the voices. The investigators and family reunited for a final confrontation with whatever evil lived in that house. Using Joe's ashes in a makeshift ritual, they scattered them while commanding the spirit to leave this family alone. Chaos erupted like a tornado had been unleashed inside. Furniture flew wildly. Winds howled through the sealed house despite every window being closed. Janet thrashed violently on the floor like something was trying to tear itself out of her, and apparitions of other ghosts, including a crying child, appeared briefly in the corners of rooms. In a strange and emotional twist, Janet's voice softened and she spoke as Maurice's deceased daughter, delivering a message of love and forgiveness that only Maurice would know. Maurice wept uncontrollably, finally releasing the grief that had consumed him for for so long. The poltergeist departed suddenly after this moment. The house fell silent for the first time in months. The family began the slow process of healing from their trauma. Maurice reconciled with his wife, Betty. Guy went on to write his book about the case, still unsure what to believe. But here's the thing that nobody talks about. While the show ended with resolution and hope, the real Enfield case never truly had a clean ending. The phenomena simply faded over time, like it got bored or moved on to something else. And that's what makes it so terrifying. Because if something that powerful can arrive without warning in an ordinary home and torment an innocent family for years, what's stopping it from happening again? What's stopping it from happening to anyone? The Hodgson family survived, but they were never quite the same, and neither. When the act came out in 2019, it shocked viewers with its portrayal of a mother-daughter relationship that was pure nightmare. The series starred Patricia Arquette as Dee Dee Blanchard and Joey King as Gypsy Rose Blanchard, telling the story of a sick child who wasn't actually sick at all. Because unlike most crime dramas, the act wasn't fiction. It was based on the true story of Gypsy Rose Blanchard, a young woman who spent her entire childhood trapped in a medical prison created by her own mother. And it ended with murder. For years, Dee Dee Blanchard was seen as a hero in Springfield, Missouri. She was the devoted single mother caring for her severely disabled daughter, Gypsy Rose, who supposedly suffered from leukemia, muscular dystrophy, epilepsy, asthma, and a dozen other conditions. Gypsy was wheelchair-bound, had a feeding tube, and according to Dee Dee, had the mental capacity of a 7-year-old. After Hurricane Katrina destroyed their Louisiana home in 2005, Habitat for Humanity built them a special pink house. The community fell in love with them. They received donations, free trips to Disney World, and charity appearances. Gypsy was even named Child of the Year. Dee Dee shaved Gypsy's head to mimic chemotherapy. She insisted on unnecessary medications that rotted Gypsy's teeth. She kept Gypsy in that wheelchair even though Gypsy could walk. Nobody suspected the horrifying truth. Gypsy Rose Blanchard was born in 1991, perfectly healthy, but from the beginning, Dee Dee claimed something was wrong. She took baby Gypsy to doctor after doctor with constantly changing symptoms. Medical records were spotty because Dee Dee moved frequently, making it impossible for doctors to verify her claims. When one doctor questioned her, she simply found another. Over the years, Gypsy underwent multiple unnecessary surgeries, including removal of her salivary glands and most of her teeth. Dee Dee kept her isolated, homeschooling her and monitoring her constantly. Gypsy wasn't allowed friends, couldn't talk to boys, and didn't even know her real age. What Dee Dee was doing had a name: Munchausen syndrome by proxy, a mental illness where a caregiver fabricates or causes illness in someone under their care to gain attention and sympathy. Dee Dee fit the pattern perfectly. She thrived on the attention and praise. And Gypsy, raised in this environment from birth, didn't know any other life existed. She believed she was sick because her mother told her she was. But as Gypsy grew older, cracks began appearing. She started questioning things. Why did she feel fine when her mother wasn't watching? She began testing her limits, secretly standing from the wheelchair, eating sugar despite her mother's claims of allergies. When a neighbor caught Gypsy walking, Dee Dee explained it away, then punished Gypsy privately by chaining her to the bed for days. The abuse escalated. Dee Dee installed cameras and alarms. She threatened to break Gypsy's fingers if she didn't cooperate. She told Gypsy the outside world was dangerous, that she needed her mother to survive. In 2012, Gypsy secretly created online profiles and started talking to men. That's how she met Nicholas Gaudejon, a young man from Wisconsin with autism and dissociative identity disorder. He and Gypsy connected immediately. For Gypsy, Nick represented everything she'd been denied: romance, freedom, a future beyond her mother's control. Gypsy confided about the abuse. She told him she wasn't actually sick, that her mother had been lying. Nick believed her, and together they started planning something dark. At first, Gypsy tried running away. In 2015, she escaped to a movie theater where she met Nick in person. They kissed during a screening of Cinderella, but Dee Dee tracked her down and dragged her home, tightening control further. Gypsy realized she would never be free as long as her mother was alive, so she and Nick made a plan. Plan B. Nick would come to Springfield and kill Dee Dee. On June 14th, 2015, Nick took a bus from Wisconsin to Missouri. Gypsy snuck him into the house while Dee Dee slept. They had sex for the first time. Then Nick went to Dee Dee's room with a knife Gypsy had taken from her mother's safe. Nick stabbed Dee Dee 17 times while she screamed and fought back. Gypsy heard everything from the bathroom, covering her ears. When it was over, they cleaned up, took money, and fled to Wisconsin, leaving Dee Dee's body in the bed. It took 2 days for neighbors to discover what happened. Gypsy had posted on Facebook, "That bitch is dead." When police found Dee Dee's body, they initially assumed Gypsy had been kidnapped, but as investigators dug deeper, they uncovered the truth. Medical records didn't match Dee Dee's claims. Doctors had suspected Munchausen by proxy, but couldn't prove it. Police tracked Gypsy's online activity and found her in Wisconsin. When officers arrived, Gypsy walked to the door on her own 2 legs. She wasn't sick. She never had been. The wheelchair sat empty. Her hair was growing back. She looked healthier than anyone had ever seen her. The truth came flooding out. Years of medical abuse, unnecessary surgeries, forced medications, a mother who imprisoned her daughter with lies and needles and pills. Both were arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The case became a media sensation. Was Gypsy a victim who deserved sympathy, or a manipulator who convinced her boyfriend to kill? Nick was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Gypsy accepted a plea deal, pleading guilty to second-degree murder. She was sentenced to 10 years. In prison, something unexpected happened. Gypsy thrived. For the first time, she had structure without abuse. She earned her GED, made friends, and reconnected with her father, Rod. In December 2023, after serving 8 years, Gypsy Rose Blanchard was released on parole. She walked out of prison into a world that had been following her story for years. The act dramatized this story across 8 episodes, showing how a mother's mental illness destroyed her daughter's childhood and led to violence. The core horror remained true. A child raised to believe she was dying, a mother who thrived on that lie, and a murder that ended years of medical torture. Gypsy Rose Blanchard's story raises uncomfortable questions. How did doctors miss the signs? Why didn't anyone question Dee Dee's constantly changing claims? How desperate does someone have to be before murder feels like freedom? And unlike most crime stories, this one didn't end with Gypsy behind bars forever. It ended with her walking free, finally able to make her own choices. The 2023 docuseries True Haunting was produced by horror filmmaker James Wan, the man behind the Conjuring franchise. The series combined real interviews with dramatic reenactments, blurring the line between documentary and horror movie. The people featured weren't actors pretending to be scared. They were real individuals recounting experiences they claim changed their lives forever. Behind the cinematic production lies 2 stories that the participants insist actually happened: the haunting of Chris DeCesare at Erie Hall and the terror experienced by the Wilson family in Salt Lake City. In 1984, Chris DeCesare was an 18-year-old freshman at SUNY Geneseo College in upstate New York. He was an avid runner, athletic and outgoing, excited to start college life. He moved into Erie Hall dormitory, room C2D1. The first few weeks were normal: parties, classes, track practice, but soon, Chris started noticing things that didn't feel right. He heard faint whispers calling his name in empty hallways. He felt inexplicable dread when entering his room. There were cold spots and shadows that vanished when he turned to look. At first, he dismissed everything as stress or homesickness, but the phenomena escalated. Chris began seeing apparitions in mirrors. He felt a presence watching him sleep at night. His friends noticed changes. He seemed distracted, tired, increasingly withdrawn. Then one night in the shower, something happened he couldn't rationalize. A ghostly figure appeared in the steam, and on the fogged glass, someone scratched the words, "Help me." He knew he hadn't imagined that. He confided in his friend Tom, who suggested trying to communicate with whatever was there using a Ouija board. Chris agreed. They attempted a makeshift seance in the dorm room. This was a mistake. After that night, everything became worse. Objects moved on their own. Doors slammed violently. Chris had vivid nightmares of a tormented man begging for help. He woke up with scratches on his body that he couldn't explain. His mental state deteriorated rapidly. He started skipping classes, losing weight, alienating friends. Other students began calling him Ghost Boy behind his back. Chris researched the dorm's history and uncovered something disturbing. There had been a former student named Thomas Boyd who died tragically years earlier. Chris became convinced this spirit was specifically targeting him. He attended a lecture on campus given by Ed and Lorraine Warren, famous paranormal investigators. He approached them afterward, desperate for help. The Warrens investigated Erie Hall using equipment to capture electronic voice phenomena. During their seance, witnesses reported seeing objects levitate. Chris himself was briefly possessed, speaking in what he claimed was Thomas Boyd's voice. Through this terrifying process, Chris learned to communicate with the spirit not through fear, but through empathy. By addressing Thomas's pain, the hauntings eventually ceased. Chris finished college and moved on, but the experience fundamentally changed him. Years later, he visited Thomas Boyd's grave. The second story takes place in Salt Lake City, Utah in 2004. April Miller was just 16 when she got pregnant. She married Matt, and by 2004, they had 2 young sons. Both ex-Mormons, they scraped together money to buy an old Victorian house in the Avenues district. Matt was a contractor, and April worked as a booker for sex workers. Money was tight, but they were excited about the house. Almost immediately, things went wrong. The house was broken into and vandalized multiple times. They installed security systems, but break-ins continued. Then stranger things began happening. They heard clanging pipes with no explanation. Shadows appeared in mirrors. Their youngest son reported seeing a man in his room at night, standing in the corner watching him. They tried to rationalize everything. Old houses make noise. Kids have nightmares. But then the entity revealed itself more directly. An inhuman figure appeared to their son, something that radiated malevolence and threat. Terrified, April and Matt burned sage throughout the house. They researched the house's history and discovered multiple violent deaths had occurred there. Murders, suicides, tragedies embedded in the walls. The hauntings peaked. Apparitions attacked family members. Objects flew across rooms. They experienced physical harm, scratches appearing on their bodies, being pushed by invisible hands. Desperate, they contacted Ed and Lorraine Warren. The Warrens investigated and confirmed multiple spirits tied to the house's violent history, but there was something worse, a demonic entity that fed on pain and fear. The Warrens performed a cleansing ritual, but the entity resisted violently. What followed was an exorcism-like confrontation that pushed everyone to their limits. Eventually, they managed to banish the entities, but the ordeal took its toll. The experience strained their marriage and challenged their faith. Eventually, they moved out, unable to live there anymore. Both stories raise questions about what we're willing to believe. Skeptics argue many elements were embellished for dramatic effect. The involvement of Ed and Lorraine Warren raises eyebrows, as they were known for sensationalizing cases. But Chris DeCesare and April Miller insist their experiences were real. They appeared on camera years later, still visibly affected. The most unsettling part isn't the jump scares, it's the aftermath. Chris graduated college, but carries those memories. April Miller and her family escaped that house, but never fully recovered. These weren't stories with clean endings. They were messy, traumatic, and deeply personal. And unlike most horror entertainment, the people involved can't just turn off the screen and walk away. They lived it, and in some ways, they're still living with it. In 2020, ITV released White House Farm, a 6-part miniseries that shocked British audiences with its portrayal of one of the UK's most notorious family murder cases. Freddie Fox plays Jeremy Bamber, the adopted son who reports a frantic call from his father, claiming his sister has gone berserk with a gun. The police arrive at the isolated Essex farmhouse to discover a horrifying scene. Neville and June Bamber shot multiple times. Their daughter Sheila Caffell with 2 gunshot wounds to her neck, a rifle beside her body, and Sheila's 6-year-old twin sons, Daniel and Nicholas, each shot in their beds. The initial assumption is murder-suicide by Sheila, who had schizophrenia, but Detective Sergeant Stan Jones notices things that don't add up, and the discovery of a silencer changes everything. But what the series couldn't fully capture was just how badly the police botched the initial investigation and how close Jeremy Bamber came to getting away with murdering 5 people. The Bamber family lived at White House Farm in Tolleshunt, Darcy, Essex. Neville Bamber, 61, and his wife June, 61, were devoutly religious and heavily involved in their local church. They had adopted 2 children, Jeremy, born in 1961, and Sheila, born in 1957. Sheila briefly worked as a model before marrying Colin Caffell and having twin sons. But the marriage fell apart, and Sheila struggled with mental health issues, diagnosed with schizophrenia after a breakdown. By 1985, she was living in London while her parents helped care for the twins. Jeremy was the problem child who never fit the family mold. His conservative religious parents disapproved of his rebellious lifestyle. Jeremy resented their control and constantly complained about working on the farm. In early 1985, Jeremy was dating Julie Mugford, a student in London. According to Julie's later testimony, Jeremy told her he wanted his parents dead. He talked about hiring someone to kill them and detailed plans about how it could be done. On the evening of August 6, 1985, Sheila and the twins were staying at White House Farm for a normal family visit. Then at 3:26 a.m. on August 7th, Jeremy Bamber called police from his home several miles away. He said his father Neville had called, saying Sheila had gone crazy with a gun. Jeremy drove to the farm and met police outside, telling officers his sister had mental health problems and could be dangerous. Armed officers surrounded the farmhouse but waited hours before entering. Inside, they found absolute horror. Neville Bamber's body was in the kitchen, shot multiple times with clear defensive wounds and evidence of struggle. June Bamber was shot in her bedroom. The 6-year-old twins lay shot in their beds, and Sheila Caffell's body was found with the rifle beside her and 2 gunshot wounds to her throat. The police response was shockingly incompetent. Officers contaminated the crime scene. Bodies were moved before being properly photographed. DCI Thomas Jones quickly settled on the murder-suicide theory. Sheila had mental illness. She was found with the gun. The case was essentially closed within hours, but some weren't convinced. Ann Eaton, Jeremy's cousin, thought his behavior was strange. He seemed too calm, almost excited, showing no real grief. Within days, Jeremy was already talking about inheriting the farm and money. Detective Sergeant Stan Jones kept noticing inconsistencies despite pressure from superiors. Sheila was a small woman, barely over 5 feet tall. The rifle was heavy and long. How could she have shot herself twice in the neck? Why 2 shots when one would have been fatal? On August 10th, 1985, just 3 days after the murders, Ann Eaton found something while helping clean the farm, a sound moderator, essentially a silencer for the rifle. She took it to police. When forensic experts examined it, they found blood inside. Sheila's blood. If the silencer had been attached when she allegedly shot herself, the gun would have been too long for her to reach the trigger while pointing it at her own throat. It was physically impossible. Sheila could not have killed herself with that weapon if the silencer was attached. Stan Jones realized Sheila hadn't killed anyone. Someone else committed these murders and tried to frame her, but DCI Taft Jones refused to reopen the case. Bodies had already been released for cremation. Meanwhile, Jeremy's behavior grew increasingly suspicious. He spent money lavishly, showing no grief. He threw parties at the farmhouse and talked openly about his substantial inheritance. His girlfriend, Julie Mugford, was becoming uncomfortable. Jeremy was acting erratically, sometimes aggressive, and she kept remembering things he had told her before the murders. On September 7th, 1985, a month after the killings, Julie Mugford walked into a police station and told them everything. Jeremy had been planning to murder his family since at least 1984. He discussed various methods and talked about the inheritance constantly. On the night of the murders, he called her afterward to confirm it was done. Julie's testimony changed everything. Police arrested Jeremy Bamber on September 8th, 1985. Jeremy denied everything, claiming Julie was a scorned girlfriend making up stories for revenge. But as police re-examined the crime scene, more evidence emerged. Bible pages in Sheila's room were disturbed in ways suggesting staging. There was no evidence of Sheila struggling or fighting, which would be expected if she had overpowered her strong father. The silencer evidence was damning. Julie's testimony was detailed and consistent. Jeremy Bamber's trial began on October 2nd, 1986. Julie Mugford testified about Jeremy's confessions, his planning, his phone call after the murders. The defense attacked her credibility, but her testimony held up. Colin Caffell testified about Sheila's mental health, but also her love for her children. He didn't believe she was capable of murdering her sons. Forensic. Experts explained why physical evidence made Sheila's guilt impossible. The prosecution presented evidence of Jeremy's lack of grief and immediate interest in inheritance. Jeremy took the stand, insisting Julie fabricated everything and claiming Sheila was violent and capable of murder. The jury didn't believe him. They reached a guilty verdict on all 5 counts of murder. On October 28, 1986, Jeremy Bamber was sentenced to 5 life terms, with a recommendation to serve at least 25 years. The judge called it one of the most horrifying cases he had encountered. Jeremy Bamber has maintained his innocence for nearly 40 years, filing multiple appeals, all rejected. In 2025, he submitted new evidence, still fighting for release, but courts have consistently upheld his conviction. The White House farm case exposed serious failures in British policing. If Anne Eaton hadn't found that silencer, if Stan Jones hadn't pushed back, if Julie Mugford hadn't come forward, Jeremy Bamber might have gotten away with murdering his entire family. The farmhouse still stands today. Colin Caffell wrote a book about losing his sons and ex-wife. The case remains one of Britain's most shocking family murders, not just because of the brutality, but because of how close the killer came to walking free. Perhaps the most chilling part is Jeremy Bamber's complete lack of remorse. In prison interviews over the years, he has never shown genuine emotion about the deaths of 5 people, including 2 6-year-old children. He focuses entirely on proclaiming his innocence, never acknowledging the victims. For the families left behind, for Colin who lost his sons, Jeremy's continued denials only add to the pain because they know the truth. The evidence proved it, the jury confirmed it, and no amount of appeals will change what happened on that August night in 1985 when Jeremy Bamber murdered 5 people for money. In 2014, HBO released True Detective, a crime drama that left audiences disturbed in a way few television shows manage. Matthew McConaughey plays Rustin Cole, a nihilistic detective haunted by his past, and Woody Harrelson plays Martin Hart, his partner struggling to maintain a normal life while investigating ritualistic murders in rural Louisiana. The series follows them across 17 years as they hunt for a serial killer connected to a shadowy cult, uncovering symbols like spirals and antlers, references to the Yellow King and a place called Carcosa, and evidence of child abuse tied to powerful families and religious institutions. The show terrified audiences with its oppressive atmosphere and disturbing violence, but as creator Nick Pizzolatto stated, this story is not based on one true case. It's inspired by multiple real events, and the reality behind those inspirations was far worse than anything the show dared to depict. March 2005, Ponchatoula, Louisiana, a small town about 50 miles northwest of New Orleans, population barely 6,000, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where churches are full on Sundays, where people trust their neighbors and pastors completely. That trust is about to be shattered. Police receive a tip about possible child abuse connected to the Hosanna Church, a small Pentecostal congregation on Highway 51. What they uncover will horrify the entire nation. The Hosanna Church is led by Pastor Louis LaMonica Jr., a 45-year-old man who presents himself as a devoted servant of God. People trust him with their children without question. But behind the prayers and hymns, something unspeakable has been happening for years. The investigation reveals that LaMonica and several church members have been systematically abusing children, some as young as 1-year-old. The abuse involves satanic rituals, though not the elaborate cosmic horror depicted in True Detective. This is real darkness, human evil wearing a religious mask. Church members confess to drugging children before assaulting them. They describe ceremonies involving pentagrams, chanting, animal sacrifices. A cat was killed during one ritual. Children were told these acts were normal, that God wanted this, that they shouldn't tell anyone. Parents trusted Pastor LaMonica completely. When he asked for private time with their children for religious instruction, they agreed without question. The The abuse occurred in the church building itself and in members' homes. It went on for years. Multiple children were victimized repeatedly, and nobody said anything because in a small religious community, questioning the pastor feels like questioning God himself. Unlike True Detective's sprawling conspiracy involving powerful political families and corrupt police, the Hosanna Church scandal was contained to this small congregation. There were no murders, no bodies staged with antlers in burned fields, no mysterious labyrinths, but in some ways that makes it more disturbing. This wasn't fictional cosmic horror. This was neighbors and church members, people trusted with children, committing unspeakable acts and hiding behind religion. When arrests began in March 2005, the community reeled. How could Pastor LaMonica, a man who preached about salvation every Sunday, be capable of such things? How could multiple church members participate and say nothing? Louis LaMonica Jr. was arrested along with several congregation members. The charges were extensive: aggravated rape, sexual battery of juveniles, pornography involving juveniles, crimes against nature. As the investigation continued, more victims came forward. The scope became clear. This had been systematic, organized, ritualized abuse occurring over multiple years with multiple perpetrators and victims. In 2006, LaMonica went to trial. The evidence was overwhelming: testimony from victims, confessions from co-conspirators, physical evidence that couldn't be explained away. The jury convicted him on multiple counts. He received 2 life sentences plus additional time. He would never leave prison. Other church members received varying sentences. The convictions were final. This had happened. These children had been abused, and the perpetrators were going to prison for a very long time. True Detective also drew inspiration from the satanic panic of the 1980s and 1990s, when Americans became convinced satanic cults were operating nationwide. The most famous case was the McMartin preschool trial in California, where daycare workers were accused of elaborate satanic rituals. No physical evidence was ever found. The case fell apart. In Arkansas, the West Memphis Three spent nearly 20 years in prison, based largely on satanic panic fears and questionable evidence. These cases involved no actual satanic abuse. The Hosanna Church case was different. The rituals were real. The abuse was real. The satanic elements were genuine, not imagined by frightened communities. Perhaps the most haunting parallel between the show and reality is institutional failure. In True Detective, Detective Rust Cole uncovers evidence of ongoing abuse connected to Tuttle-funded schools and churches, but his superiors shut him down. The powerful Tuttle family uses political connections to bury investigations. In reality, the Hosanna Church operated for years with warning signs that were ignored or explained away. People suspected something was wrong, but didn't want to believe it. Parents noticed changes in their children's behavior, but trusted the pastor's explanations. The abuse continued because nobody wanted to look too closely at a respected religious leader. After the convictions, Ponchatoula struggled to heal. Families were torn apart. Some defended the convicted. Others felt betrayed by people they had trusted completely. The church building still stands, but is no longer used. Nobody wants to worship in a place where such horrors occurred. The children who survived carry trauma that will last their entire lives. Some have spoken publicly, trying to help other victims come forward. Others have remained silent, unable to relive the nightmare. True Detective ended with Detective Kolu nearly dying in Carcosa's labyrinth, then surviving and finding a measure of peace. The show suggests that while they caught one killer, the larger conspiracy remains intact. The real ending is messier. Louis LaMonica is in prison. Other church members are in prison, but there was no grand conspiracy to expose, no powerful families to bring down, just ordinary people in a small church doing terrible things to children and getting away with it for years because nobody wanted to believe it was happening. In the final episode, Rust Cola tells his partner about a near-death experience where he noticed the light is winning against the dark. It's a moment of hope after 8 episodes of bleakness. The real victims of the Hosanna Church don't get such neat closure. They live with what happened to them every day. Some have found peace through therapy. Others still struggle with trust, with relationships, with the basic sense of safety that was stolen from them as children. True Detective remains one of television's most disturbing crime dramas precisely because it taps into real fears about darkness lurking beneath respectable surfaces. The fictional cult and cosmic horror elements make it entertaining, but the core truth that children can be systematically abused by trusted authority figures while institutions fail to protect them is absolutely real. Ponchatoula, Louisiana proved that, and dozens of similar cases across America continue to prove it. Sometimes the real horror isn't cosmic or supernatural. Sometimes it's just human evil operating in plain sight while everyone looks away, and that's far more terrifying than any Yellow King or Carcosa could ever be. These shows remind us that sometimes the most terrifying stories aren't created by writers in Hollywood. They happen to real people in real places, and in many cases, the truth was far darker than anything the shows dared to reveal. The next time you watch a series that claims to be based on true events, remember that somewhere behind those dramatized scenes are actual human beings who experienced genuine horror, and for them, there's no such thing as a series finale.